So we have four major world religions in the world. Christianity is by far the world's largest religion. Islam is second, and we have Hinduism and Buddhism. Here we go. This data is from the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, Islam was the third largest religion, with about 12% of the world's population. We had more Hindus and a lot more Christians and Muslims at the time. By the end of the century, we see that Islam rose to the second largest religion, second only to Christianity. Of course, the numbers in all of these religious communities have increased, but the percentage, you can see that the percentage was greater in Islam. So Islam was the fastest growing major religion in the 20th century. According to the Pew Center research, Islam also will be the fastest growing religion in the 21st century. So by 2060, Islam is expected to become the world's largest religion. And that's both a function of rapid population growth in Muslim countries, but also conversion, because Islam, like Christianity, is a universal religion, allows for conversion, again, has missionaries. So when we look at the data today, we have about a third of the world population that is Christian, about a fourth that is Muslim, and a sixth that's Hindu. Smaller number are Buddhists, only less than 6%. So we have a vast Muslim population in the world. And this vast Muslim population is found in over 100 different countries. 57 of these countries are members of the Organization of Islamic Conference. So they belong to the Organization of Islamic Conference. Look at the distribution of Muslims around the world. We see that we have Muslims, oh, here we go. In Western Asia, in Northern Africa, the northern half of Africa, but also in Southeast Asia. We find Muslim minorities in many countries around the world as well, in China, in Russia, in the United States, in Canada, in Brazil, in Argentina. So Islam started in West Asia, in a city called Mecca. Mecca was an important religious center even before the arrival of Islam. But from Mecca, it very quickly spread to neighboring countries. So if you follow the map here, we can see that within a matter of years, it spread from Mecca into what's now Iraq and Syria and Turkey, eventually into Egypt, Libya, all the way to Morocco, Spain, and Portugal. And through trade, later on, centuries later, has spread to places like Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and coastal East Africa. Even though Islam originated in the Middle East, the largest Muslim populations are not in the Middle East. The largest Muslim populations are found in places like Indonesia. Not all Indonesians are Muslim, but the majority are. Over 230 million are Muslim. About 80 are non-Muslim. Some Christians, some Buddhists, some Hindu, some practice tribal religions. Pakistan has the second largest Muslim population. India, which is primarily a Hindu country, has a large Muslim minority. So we have over 1 billion Hindus, but we have about 200 million Muslims. Bangladesh, tiny country with a population larger than that of Russia. Again, not all Bengalis are Muslim. We have some small minority of Hindus and a small minority of Christians. Nigeria, about half the Nigerian population is Muslim, the other half is Christian. Egypt, and you see that I have highlighted Egypt. It's the first large Arab country with a Muslim majority. We'll come back to that in a second. Iran and Turkey. So of all of these countries on the list, only Egypt is an Arab country. Not all Egyptians are Muslim. Egypt was one of the first countries to convert to Christianity. We still have a very influential and important Christian minority in Egypt. This might be, I guess, a shock to many of us. The three largest Muslim majority countries, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, have already elected a woman president. How many women president have we had in this country? Not yet, hopefully soon. Most of us confuse Arabs and Muslims. So we want to distinguish between the two groups. Arabs are people who speak Arabic, regardless of what religion they practice. Some Arabs are Christians, some are Baha'is, some are Jewish. The majority are Muslim. They simply speak Arabic. There are about 330 million Arabic speakers in the world. Most Muslims are not Arabs. We have almost 2 billion Muslims and 330 million Arabs, so you can do the math, especially since not all Arabs are Muslim. Most Arab Americans are Christian. Many have migrated 100 years ago or so. Many early immigrants to this country came from places like Syria and Lebanon, and they were Christian. They speak Arabic, but they're not Muslim. And most Muslim Americans are not Arabs. Again, probably when we think of Muslim and Muslim women, this is not what we think of. 9 Muslim majority countries have already elected a woman president or prime minister. Is that surprising to many of us? That's what we think when we think of Muslim women. So Megawati Soekarno-Putri was the president of Indonesia. Nazir Bhutto was elected prime minister to Pakistan twice. She would have elected a 3rd time if she had not been assassinated. Have been the longest serving prime minister in the history of the country. Sheikh Hasina is the current president of Bangladesh. She's the longest serving prime minister in the history of Bangladesh. And Bangladesh elected a woman president in the 1960s. So when we think of Islam, we need to remember that Islam, like Christianity, has a great deal of diversity. Yes, all Muslims believe in the basic sources of Islamic law or Sharia. But most Muslim countries do not have Sharia law. Sometimes I find amusing that people in Missouri are worried about Sharia law, or people in Texas are, we don't want Sharia law here. Well, don't worry about it. Most Muslim countries don't even have it. Of the 57 Muslim majority countries, 3 have Sharia law, 54 don't. They have British common law or French Napoleonic law. So the source of Muslim law comes from the Quran, the Muslim holy book, the Hadith, the example set by by Muhammad, the precedent set by the Prophet Muhammad. In some cases, they would use parallel judgment. In some cases, things did not exist in the 7th century when Islam was founded. So what they do is look at similar judgment on an issue that's very close. Malaysia did that with when they dealt with drugs. They figured if alcohol is prohibited because it messes with your mind, then drugs should be prohibited for the same reason, parallel judgment. The problem in Islam is that we have something called ijtihad, interpretation. Ideally, what you would like to do is have consensus on interpretation. Can we have consensus on anything? In this room, can you imagine 2 billion people agreeing on one thing? So when it comes to interpretation, the devil is in the details and in the interpretation. Even within the same country, we have so many different interpretations. So when we think of how should Muslim women dress, I've used this, I guess, in some of my classes. The Quran simply talks about modesty in dress. That's all it says. And it doesn't specify modesty for women. It says modesty in dress for all people, men and women. Which of these women looks like he's dressed modestly? She looks like a Muslim woman. You had to guess which one of these is a Muslim woman. Can you guess? All Muslim women. So why do they dress differently? Because they live in different environments. They are influenced by different cultures. I remember when I first went to Erie, Pennsylvania, I've experienced cold. In Jerusalem, actually gets some snow, believe it or not, but nothing like Erie, Pennsylvania. Are we surviving the snow? They got a foot of snow last night. The highways were closed in Erie, Pennsylvania. Nobody has to tell you you have to wear a coat. If you don't wear a coat, you won't have to worry about it the next day because you'll be frozen to death. So people dress according to the environment. If you live in a hot climate, of course, you're going to cover as much of your skin as possible, especially if you had sandstorms. You don't want sand pebbles hitting you in the face at 30, 40 miles an hour. So when our troops were serving in Iraq and Kuwait, they would wear goggles and they would cover all their faces. They want to protect themselves. So yes, when we think of how women dress, many of us unfortunately think of this group. This is unfortunately partly our fault because the Taliban took over power in Afghanistan because we helped to overthrow the socialist government of Afghanistan. We were fighting the Soviets, the Russians, and we established an unholy alliance with the Saudis, who used and abused religion to recruit holy warriors, mujahideen, who became the Taliban. And when the Russians were defeated and left Afghanistan, we also left Afghanistan. And the women were abandoned. And the women had to deal. That's not how Afghani women dressed before the overthrow of the socialist government. Think of these women as Muslim women? Is that your stereotype? It's our Muslim women. The vast majority of Muslim women dress like us, like you in this classroom. You don't notice them because you have an ingrained image in your mind what they should look like and how they should dress. So you could be a beauty queen from the United States. You could be an action actress. You could be the queen of Jordan. That's how most of them dress. Miss Australia, not 2017, was a Muslim. Could you tell that she was Muslim? Again, that's not the image we have ingrained in our heads. As Ben was, I guess, mentioned, I went with a group of American professors to conduct some research in Malaysia and Indonesia. And Malaysia is a Muslim democracy. They have 11 states. Their flag looks like the American flag. You'll confuse it with the American flag. They were inspired by the American Revolution. So they have 13 states and 13 tribes to represent the 13 states. Of the 13 states, 2 were ruled by Islamist parties. This is the most conservative of Malaysian states. So when we went there, are the women dressed in black? Not a single one of them dressed in black. Because they're smart. You don't want to dress in black when it's hot and humid. It's just common sense. So why do Saudi women or Afghani women dress in black? Oh, because the men who rule over these countries force them to dress in black. Maybe someday when the women take over, they can force the men to dress in black, and they can dress in white. In some countries, until recently, some countries wanted to prevent women from dressing in certain ways. So this is Turkey. In Turkey, until recently, until maybe 14 years ago, 10 years ago, women were not allowed to wear a scarf. Turkey in 1923 wanted to abandon its Islamic heritage and join Europe. So they wanted to pretend to be European. 3% of the Turkish territories is in Europe, but they believe they are European. They've been trying to join the European Union for decades. So part of that was, let's abandon our Islamic or traditional dress. So for men, beards were abolished. They established what's called the beard tax, and men would have to pay a tax if you went to Turkey. But for women, they were not allowed to wear a scarf. If you wear a scarf, you were not allowed into government buildings or into public schools. That continued until 2013. So it's less than 10 years ago that the ban on scarf was lifted in Turkey. Not all Turkish women were happy with this, of course. Some Turkish women wanted the ban to continue. They wanted to dress in European dress, not in traditional dress. Unfortunately, this is a dress that's common in Afghanistan even today, after 20 years of US involvement. We made some progress in Afghanistan, but as soon as we left Afghanistan, many Afghani women are forced to revert to severe restriction imposed by the Taliban. Some women in Afghanistan are not allowed to work. This is the story of a woman that had no choice. She was not allowed to work. She pretended to be a man, a young man, a boy, so she can work and support her family. This became an Oscar-winning documentary movie. Women now in Afghanistan are targeted. Activist women are targeted by the Taliban. Banned from TV. Many are not allowed to pursue an education. So when we think of Islam and Muslim women, we have to understand we have so many different variables, so many different realities. Some Muslim countries are democracies, like Turkey. Some would question how democratic Turkey is today with the current regime, but it's a secular democracy. Right next door to Turkey, we have Iran, which has this curious mix of theocracy and democracy. They have elections for parliament, for president, but the unelected religious leaders have the most power. The Grand Ayatollah is called Supreme Leader. I'm not making it up. That's his official title, Supreme Leader. He has the most power. Some countries like Malaysia, and we said it depends on which state of Malaysia you go to, you'll find many different dresses, realities, lifestyles. However, unfortunately, most of the Muslim countries are ruled by dictators, monarchs, autocrats. And that's why they don't have, whether it's men or women, they don't have many civil rights, many human rights. So if we look at this map, we can see that many Muslim countries, from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, through Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, all the way to Morocco, are ruled by dictators. Some of them have allowed women to pursue an education, allowed women to participate in the economy. In the UAE, women fly fighter jets to bomb ISIS targets. Next door, in Iraq and Syria at the time, we had ISIS enslaving women and forcing them into marriages. Afghanistan is probably the most extreme example, and that's probably one of the reasons why we have the images we have ingrained in our heads. Again, most Afghanis don't have access to good health care, but women especially don't have access to good health care. About 80% of women in Afghanistan are illiterate. They're not allowed to attend schools. Young girls are not allowed to attend schools. 1 in 3 Afghani women experience physical, psychological, or sexual violence. Life expectancy in Afghanistan is very low, one of the lowest in the world. That's true for men and women, shockingly low. And this is probably the most shocking. I know that we have TV shows here like Married at First Sight, and that's an exciting show. In Afghanistan, it's not an exciting show, it's the reality. Fathers usually broker marriages, and the woman doesn't get to see her husband until wedding night. In most cases, unfortunately, it's not a pleasant surprise. This is the first time you see your husband. He could be, this is, again, it's like a business arrangement. This is the husband your father chose for you because he paid large enough dowry, or he has the wealth to marry somebody who is probably 40, 50 years younger than him. A woman refuses to marry the husband that her father chose for her. Sometimes women are attacked. We've had instances of acid thrown in their faces because the men think, if you think I'm not good enough for you, you're not going to be good enough for anybody. If I can't marry you, nobody else can. So when we think of Afghanistan, again, we are partially to blame for this because we agreed to allow the Saudis to use their interpretation of Islam and export it to Afghanistan, which is severely limited women's rights. So when we think of Afghanistan, let's look at Afghanistan, look at its neighbors. Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. They are all Muslim countries. The people of Afghanistan speak the same languages as these countries around them, as the Pashtun in Pakistan, Hazara, Dari spoken as dialect of Persian. Some speak Turkic, Tajik, some speak Uzbeki. So when we look at these countries and we look at literacy rate for women, is there a big difference between the neighboring countries? They speak the same language. They share the same history. They share the same faith. What's different? The interpretation. Who provided the interpretation? Saudi Wahhabi religious leaders that were imported from Saudi Arabia. You don't find these in Iran or Kyrgyzstan or Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan. So when we look at the massive difference in literacy rate, the only explanation is the Saudi influence that was brought into Afghanistan. What about women in Saudi Arabia? One of our best allies, maybe not the best, one of our allies. Let's put it that way. Women were severely restricted. Women were restricted to few professions, teaching, nursing, secretaries. Some jobs were not suited for their well-being. So they were restricted to very few professions. Women could not study or travel abroad, even travel within Saudi Arabia without the explicit permission of a male relative, without permission from their male guardian. Women sometimes were punished for things that we would never consider a crime. This is a case that maybe attracted international attention. Eventually, the President of the United States had to intervene because this woman who was gang raped, she was sentenced to jail, 6 months in jail and 200 lashes. What is her crime? Oh, she should have never been with another man who is not related to her. She brought it on to herself. That's the Saudi interpretation. The crime happened because she allowed it to happen. She should have never been with another male who's not related to her. So this is shocking. Another woman, an 84-year-old woman, died in police custody because she dared to take one of those private taxis like an Uber. Of course, the man is not related to her. The Saudi woman is not allowed to be in the same room with an unrelated male. So that's a crime. So we have some amazing and severe restrictions. Iran has made a lot of headlines in the last 2 months for the wrong reasons. Since September, there is something that we call the Persian paradox. Iranian women are well educated. 70% of college students are women in Iran. 80% of all doctors are women. Women serve in the military. They serve in the parliament. They're elected to parliament. But the government restricts how they dress, how much makeup they wear, how tight the jeans can be, what kind of colors they're allowed to wear. They have something called the morality police to enforce the dress code. Of course, young Iranian men and women would like to have fun, just like everybody else. But in Iran, dating before marriage is not allowed. So how do they get around this? They have something called temporary marriage. This is with the blessing of the religious leaders. So you can go and get yourself a license to get married for the weekend. When the weekend is over, no strings attached. If you'd like to go to spring break, to Aruba, and you'd like to have some fun with somebody, then, let's get married for the week. When the week is over, everybody goes their separate ways. You can make it for a weekend, for a week, for a month, for a year, and then there are no restrictions on either one when the marriage ends. No legal liabilities. This is some of the, again, a whole brigade in the Iranian military is made up of women. So women serve in many economic sectors, but, and this is not new, women have been restricted in how they dress, how much makeup they wear, how much hair they show. They had to wear a scarf. So usually over the years, women have been arrested and taken to a police station and given a re-education course about modesty. This became a big issue, of course, when an Iranian woman, when Mahsa Amini died in police custody. Many believe she was beaten to death, tortured to death. What is her crime? She was showing too much hair. Her scarf did not cover all her hair. Since then, young men and women have been taken to the streets. They don't want these restrictions. They're educated. They know what's happening in the rest of the world. They know what Iran was like. If you go back to Iran before the Islamic Revolution, Tehran was the Paris of the East. Fashions would be introduced in Paris, and they would arrive in Tehran before they arrived in New York. Not anymore. So these men and women want to go back to being part of the international community, part of the modern world. They don't want religious leaders in their 80s to tell them how to dress. Unfortunately, because of these protests across the country, 326, maybe more, people have died. Some been shot dead by the police. Revolutionary guards. 14,000 have been arrested. Some have been sentenced to death. So again, restrictions on dress. When we think of Muslim women, there is no question that Muslim women in some certain countries face severe restrictions. We can probably identify 3 countries: Afghanistan, number 1, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, where they have the most severe restrictions. But what about in the United States? Look at, this is a study that focused on development across gender inequality index. Women have made the most progress in the Middle East. This might come as a surprise, but maybe the base was low. So they're making progress from a very low base. The greatest improvement have been in Western Asia and North Africa. What about in the United States? Are women equal to men? Do women enjoy the same pay for equal work? Do women have equal representation? Look at that. In 2017, the United States, again, women in power, women in Congress, women in the Senate. Who does better, the United States or Canada? The United States or Mexico? Look at all these countries in the Americas that do better than us. Look at all these countries in Africa that do better than us. Look at Afghanistan and Iraq. Afghanistan and Iraq had more women in parliament than we had women in Congress. How did that happen? When we liberated Iraq, when we liberated Afghanistan, we insisted that their constitution has a clause, at least 1/3 of Congress people have to be women. It was a quota. And the parties had to provide enough women candidates to meet that quota. So this is the shocking part. The United States was ranked 96 in the world when it comes to women political empowerment. 96. We did not do as well as Canada. The good news is we're making some progress. We're heading in the right direction, but we still have a long way to go. So this is, I guess, before the elections last week. In the United States, we have 24 women senators, 24%. We had 28%. 123 was a new record. This is the largest number of women we've had. Women make up 52% of the US population. Is 24% acceptable? 28% acceptable? Women vote in larger number than men. In every election, about 10 million more women vote than men. So that's what we need. We need more women to vote for women candidates. We need to have maybe proportional representation. I'm certainly against quotas, but 24% doesn't cut it. Maybe in this university, you're fortunate to have a woman president and woman provost. We need more women leaders. After the election last week, we have 12 governors out of 50 that are women. This is the record. 12 out of 24%. We still have 24 women in the Senate. We don't know how many will end up in the House because some races have not been called, but 121, basically 27%. It might be slightly less than we had in the 117 Congress. Again, certainly not enough. You probably heard that Los Angeles has elected its first female mayor. So we're making some progress. We're making history. We have more governors. We still need a lot more senators. The record is 26 senators. We're down to 24. Again, more women are registered to vote and more women do vote than men. So when we think of Islam, maybe some of us don't quite understand how we have all these severe restrictions in some countries. Islam is a reflection of history, of a reflection of culture, and many people study hermeneutics. So understanding religion in historical context. If we look at what does Islam say about certain issues like marriage, inheritance, work, and dress, we might be surprised. Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, worked before he became a prophet, worked after he became a prophet. His boss was a woman, an international businesswoman that would send caravan to bring goods from Yemen and Ethiopia and transport it all the way to Syria and what's now Turkey. They used to have 2 trips a year. So he worked for this. He was one of hundreds of men that worked for this woman. This is the 7th century. How many women in the 7th century have international business that employed hundreds of men? He married this woman, and then he didn't have to work. She made all the money. So that's maybe a good way to go. Just find yourself a wealthy businesswoman and you can become a prophet. You don't have to worry about working for a living. His daughter led men into battle. Oh yeah, they were riding horses and camels at the time, but think of that when you think of Saudi Arabia restricting women from driving today. If women could ride horses and camels then, like men did, and go into battle, why would you not allow women to drive? Does it make any sense? This is some of the, again, quotes from the Quran and from the Hadith about what Islam said about women. Women are the twin halves of men. The rights of women are sacred. They are to be maintained in the rights assigned to them. And when the Prophet was asked about what is my duty to my wife, his answer was, you feed her as you eat, as you feed yourself. You clothe her as you clothe yourself. You don't abuse her. Treat her as you treat yourself. Again, the best men among you are those who are best to their wives. This is 7th century Arabia, where women were allowed to work. This is from the Quran. There is a chapter on the Quran that's called Surah An-Nisa, the chapter on women. This is actually what the Quran says. In Islam, you're not allowed to translate the Quran. You can interpret it, but you cannot translate it. It's preserved in its original language. So, what does it say here? For men, there is a reward for what they have earned, and likewise for women, there is a reward for what they have earned. So in the Quran, it says, women can keep their earnings. This is in 7th century. How many civilizations in the 7th century allowed women to keep their earnings? What about inheritance? It says the same thing here. There's a share for men and a share for women, for what is left by parents or relatives. Whether that property is small or large, women have a legal share. How many societies in the 7th century gave women the right to inheritance? Of course, this runs in the face of the birthplace of Islam, Saudi Arabia, where women don't have anywhere close to the same rights they enjoyed in the 7th century. They have restrictions on work and education and driving and shopping. Women make up only 4% of the labor force. They're 50% of the Saudi population, native Saudi population, but only 4% of the labor force. Of course, we have somebody who wants to present himself to us as a reformer, Mohammed bin Salman. He wants to modernize Arabia, Saudi Arabia. Of course, it's called Saudi Arabia because the House of Saud is in control. So if it's like if we wanted to change the name of America, the United States, you can say Biden's America or Trump's America. That's what they do in Saudi Arabia. So Mohammed bin Salman is trying to change this. He's finally ending this unholy alliance between the House of Saud, who control the politics and economics of the country, and the House of Wahhab, who controlled religion and religious life in the country. So part of that, as of 2018, about 50,000 women were granted the right to drive. More will be granted the right to drive later on. But we have over 10 million women in Saudi Arabia, not counting the guest workers that live in Saudi Arabia. More jobs are open to women. Women can now go to sports stadiums. They can watch soccer games in person, live. And again, this is important, the cracking down on the Wahhabis and Salafis. They changed in the textbook to teach moderate Islam, not the Islam they exported to Afghanistan, not the Islam they were trying to export to the rest of the world. And they want, this is crucial, ending support for Salafi Islamic mosques across the world. This is what they exported to Afghanistan. This is what we've been trying to export to other countries. And they're trying to basically remake Saudi Arabia in the image of Dubai. So we have a lot more freedoms, not political freedoms, but social freedoms, economic freedoms. Don't go into politics here. So women can now go and watch soccer games. They're excited about this. Women are allowed to drive. Of course, Islam is not just a religion that we find in the Middle East or in Indonesia or Pakistan. We find Islam in America. And American Muslims represent and reflect the diversity of Muslims worldwide. When we look at Muslim Americans, 25% are Black, 24% are white, 18% are Asian, 18% are Arab. Remember, we're talking about Arabs versus Muslims. Some are Hispanic, some are multiracial. So after 9/11, some people were like, we need to be able to identify Muslims at airports. How do we do that? And then they looked at the chart like, oh, they're Black, they're white, they're Asian, they're multiracial, they're Hispanic. You have to arrest everybody. So everybody could be Muslim. Again, Islam is a world religion found in many different countries. So it's not restricted to just one region or one race. This might be surprising to many of us. Muslim women are more likely than Muslim men to pursue higher education. Muslim women are better educated than Muslim men. Muslim women are more likely to be thriving economically than Muslim men. That's the Pew Foundation research. Far more educated, far more successful in the economy than Muslim men. Now we wanted to leave some time for questions and answers. I'm sure you have plenty of questions. Hopefully I'll have some of the answers. So I'll turn it over to Ben and we can take some questions, some reactions. You have a microphone in the back if anybody has questions or has comments or. First question, you got somebody over here? No question is ignorant. Again, they come in many different names. Salafists are the same group as the Wahhabis. When Saudi Arabia was established, we had two big tribes that were competing for power. One was the House of Saud, who took over the government. The House of Wahhab were basically this religious group that, puritanical religious group that wanted to go back to the old teachings of Islam. They're called Salafists and they're called Wahhabis. It's the same group. This is the ideology that was exported out of Saudi Arabia to places like Afghanistan. So their interpretation of Islam is not accepted by the vast majority of Muslims, but it was the dominant interpretation in Saudi Arabia. So no longer, again, this is one of the things maybe we can be grateful to MBS. One of the few things we can be grateful to MBS for is he's trying to end the Salafi influence in Saudi Arabia and in the rest of it. Another question over here? Oh, yes. Yeah, the question was, can you talk about the diversity of Afghanistan and the different groups or tribes that live there?
And how that impacts how they get along with each other, even here, even the ones that are coming here.
Or how they don't get along with each other?
That's what I mean.
So it's a very good question. Afghanistan in many ways similar to Iraq. I remember, I guess President Biden was interviewed years ago about how do we solve the problem in Afghanistan and how do we solve the problem in Iraq? And the simple answer was, we have to redraw the borders. Afghanistan is a country of many different groups. The Pashtun are the largest group. There are almost equal number of Pashtuns in Pakistan as we have in Afghanistan. So it was easy for them to go back and forth during the war because the brothers across the border would be more than happy to welcome them and help them. This is the largest group. They speak Pashto. Then we have some group, the Hazara, who speak a Persian dialect, the Dari. Then we have some that are Turkmen, Uzbek. So we have the Northern Alliance, who are Turkic-speaking population. This is the group that we used as our foot on the ground. They were the foot soldiers that helped us take over Afghanistan and overthrow the Taliban, because we did not want to send our troops to do that. So we helped arm the Northern Alliance, the Turkic-speaking minorities in the north, to drive out the mostly Pashto-speaking Taliban. So do they get along? Of course not. They are competing for power and have been competing for power. The Taliban consolidated the rule in the 1990s. And then when we went in, we used the minorities. And that's why we didn't really have much influence among the Pashto speaking, almost half the population speaks Pashto. So that was part of the problem we had, is that the government of Afghanistan had control of Kabul, but not control of the Pashto region that makes up almost half of the country. So when we withdraw, of course, the largest group are the Pashtun speakers, the Pashtun tribe, who came and took control of the government again. So that's why the Taliban are back in power. Other minorities, unless they unite, they don't have as much power or influence. They speak different languages. They have connections to different countries. Hazara are connected to Iran. The Uzbeki are connected to Uzbekistan. The Tajik are connected to Tajikistan. So different groups with different culture, language. So this is one of the problems in the whole region, is that the boundaries do not reflect historic, tribal, linguistic, cultural differences. And unless you have a country like ours where language doesn't matter, where maybe your religion doesn't matter, your culture doesn't matter, you have equality for all, you'll have this competition between all these different groups. So they don't get along there. I don't expect them to get along here either, because they've had these historic differences, this struggle for power and influence. I have a couple of questions in the back.
You have two major sides of Muslims. One are Shias and Sunnis, and they don't get along either, really, as far as I understand. But which are the most dominant in the world, Sunnis or Shias?
That's a very good question. Again, this is maybe something we don't understand quite about Islam, is that they all share the same basic belief. The division between Sunni and Shia happened just about maybe 50 to 60 years after the birth of Islam. It wasn't about religion, it was about politics. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, we had succession. We had a new president, if you want. The president at the time was the political leader, but also the religious leader. So they elected the first caliph, successor. And then when he died, they elected the second one without a problem. By the time they got to the third and fourth one, we already had some competition. There was no consensus candidate. So by the time they got to the fourth successor, some proposed it's one candidate. The other group proposed a second candidate. One of the candidates was related to the prophet. His name is Ali. So the group that known as Shia supported Ali. They were known as Shia to Ali, supporters of Ali. Ali, of course, was selected as caliph, but the opposition came across and fought for power. So we have the first civil war. It wasn't about religion. It was about political succession. Who will control the government? Who would be the leader? So Ali was assassinated, and the Shia retreated into what's now Iraq, where they had major battles, and they lost. And some fled into Iran. That's why Iraq and Iran, you go back to the maps that we had, Iraq and Iran are the only two major Shia countries in the region. Iran has about 90% Shia population. Iraq has about 60% Shia population. If you ask Muslims in most countries, are you Shia or Sunni? They probably wouldn't even know what you're asking about. They don't know that difference. It became a major issue when colonial powers used it to divide and rule. So in many countries, you have the minority group in control. So in Iraq, which has a Shia majority, the British installed a Sunni king from Saudi Arabia. He's not Iraqi, he's from Saudi Arabia. So the Iraqis had a way to deal with him. They blew up the entire presidential palace with everybody in it. And that was the end of that Saudi monarchy in Iraq. So we had a Shia majority and a Sunni leadership. The Sunnis were in charge. Saddam Hussein was from Sunni, the Sunni triangle in the middle. The Sunnis made up only 20% of the Arabs, and they make only about less than 40% of the population, maybe 37% of the Iraqi population. In neighboring Syria, the majority are Sunni. Tiny minority are Shia, but the Assad family is from a Shia minority. Of course, they rule over the country. So it's not about Sunni and Shia, it's about power, who controls resources, who gets their roads paved, who gets the scholarships, who gets to the leadership of the military. So in most Muslim countries, people don't actually understand whether they're Sunni or Shia. There are different schools of thoughts in Islam, but they don't associate that with Sunni or Shia. This became a big issue now because Saudi Arabia is leading the Sunni bloc that's trying to contain and control Iranian influence. And Iran is the largest Shia country in the world. But Iran and Saudi Arabia were our allies when they were both dictatorships, when they had the Shah in Iran and when we had the monarchy in Saudi Arabia. The last major visitor to Iran when the Shah was about to be overthrown was the Saudi king. He went to the palace in Tehran when they had no electricity because of the strikes in the oil industry in Iran. So this is not about religion. This is about politics. And again, divide and rule policies. In many countries in the region, we have minority rule. Population had no say on who rules over them. And that's the problem when you have the divide and rule politics. But the difference, the Sunnis are by far the majority worldwide. About 90% of the 2 billion Muslims are Sunni, only 10% are Shia.
Hi, thank you. My name is Deb Fallows. Could you talk for a little bit about why you think MBS has loosened some of the constraints on women and where you think this might be going or not?
That's a very good question. Most of us, if we are familiar with MBS, we would suspect, we would question his motives. He's certainly trying to present himself to the world as a reformer, as a modernist. But at the same time, he has imprisoned many women activists. He wants to take credit for anything good that happened in Saudi Arabia. And he would never take any blame for anything bad that emanates from Saudi Arabia. So he's trying to present himself as a reformer. He wants to, again, allow the young to let off some steam. So he opened the movie theaters after being closed for decades. He's trying to establish resorts along the Red Sea. He wants to allow for social opening, but not political opening. So he's using basically the Chinese model. Will give people more social freedom, maybe more economic opportunities, but don't worry about politics. We want full and unquestionable control of the government. So I think he's playing that, if you want, dual role, severe restrictions on political discourse, while allowing for some social and economic opening. So whether he's spending billions of dollars on entertainment, bringing in major soccer teams to play in Saudi Arabia, allowing concerts and movies, these things that would not have been even thought possible 5 years ago in Saudi Arabia. So he's trying to polish his image in the world while maintaining full control within the country. And he thinks by allowing these social openings and economic opportunities, he can win some of the young to support him. That answer your question? I have a couple of questions in the back there.
Phil Courtney, I've been struck by this irony that the United States, which prides itself on being so progressive and so far ahead of other countries, we've yet to elect an American president who's a woman. Yet some of these countries that we think we're so far ahead of, like India and Pakistan, of course, have done that years ago. And now we seem to be going somewhat backwards, with the recent Supreme Court ruling. What do you think explains some of the dynamics that these countries like Pakistan have had women presidents long before we've even gotten close?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Again, sometimes perception and reality might be different things. And we'll have to understand that in the case of Pakistan and even in the case of Indonesia, the women that were elected don't represent women reality in the entire country. So in Pakistan, it depends on where you live. If you live in the south, in Karachi, if you live in the center where you have the political power in Punjab, you have more freedom, more access to education, more access to economic opportunities. If you live in the Pashtun region in the Northwest Territories, you would be severely restricted. So Benazir Bhutto became prime minister because her father was a leader. She comes from a powerful political party. The same thing with Megawati Sukarno Putro in Indonesia. Her father was the president of Indonesia. So that doesn't mean all women have the same kind of opportunities. But certainly, the fact that a woman could be elected president is impressive. Are we surprised that we have not elected a woman president in this country? I'm certainly shocked. I mean, when you think of 52-53% of the voting population is made up of women, we should have elected, but our parties have not, again, controlled by old white men. They control, if you want, they filter who goes in for nomination. I certainly expect that in the future, women will be the stronger sex and will be the dominant gender in politics and economics. If history tells us anything, I mean, many will look at leadership in business. Women in business do better than men in business. and they provide greater sharing of resources and opportunities than do men. So yes, we have a long way to go, but I guess Nancy Pelosi announced today that she would not be running for leadership. When she entered Congress, there were 23 women in Congress. Now we have 123 women. Hopefully it won't take long for women to become the majority, because they are the majority of Americans and they are the majority of voters. And I think maybe when we have this generational change, we can see it's taken us a lot longer than it's taken other countries. There's no question about it. If Italy, if Brazil, if Argentina, if Indonesia, if Pakistan, if Bangladesh can elect women president, so can the United States. Thank you. We have a couple of questions on this side.
My name is Jane. Thank you for your presentation. It sounds like if your answer to the gentleman who just asked the question is, in politics, it can happen if there is a man who has ties to a wise woman. That wise woman can succeed. Now, in this country, women are still making their way in the sciences, in engineering, in technology. Yes, it's happening, as we saw Dawn speak on Tuesday. What a marvelous representative for all of us she was. Is that freedom happening in Muslim countries with women? Are women making their way to the top of, not just because 70% of women are doctors in Saudi,
In Iran. you mean.
in Iran?
Yes.
Okay. Not just in those rare exceptions, but is it happening? Okay, maybe not in Afghanistan because they can't even read, they aren't schooled, but in most other places?
The simple answer to this, it depends on which country we're talking about. It varies greatly from one country to another. But do women have the opportunity to engage in science, math, STEM, if you want, fields, and health? Absolutely. It depends on the country. But like you said, progress is taking a lot longer in some countries than in others. And progress is taking way too long in this country. So in some Muslim countries, we're well ahead of us when it comes to science, technology, economics, politics. In some countries, they will still lag well behind much of the world. So it depends on what country we're making. Are we making progress? I think the United Nations studies showed that the Middle East had made the most progress when it comes to gender equality. There's no question we're starting from a low base, but we're making progress. We still have a long way to go. Some question in the back here.
So the Quran is like the direct word of God. And my question is how, if it's the direct word and that's what you should follow, if you're Muslim, how can the Taliban in Afghanistan versus other Muslims have such differing interpretations? And how did America think they could change those interpretations of the Taliban?
That's a great question. I don't know if we want to change the interpretation of the Taliban, but let's go back in history here and look at this unholy alliance. When the Soviets went into Afghanistan to support the socialist government, we wanted to counter the Soviet influence. And to do that, we partnered with two countries, Pakistan, which was right next door, which would provide the training camps, which would provide the intelligence, and Saudi Arabia, which would provide the money and which would provide the ideology. At that time, we were not concerned about how absurd the Saudi ideology interpretation of the Quran was. Now, to understand the Taliban, 90% of the Taliban are illiterate, which means they can't read their own language. They can't read Pashto. The Quran is written in classical Arabic. It's preserved in its original text, the original version of the Quran. So even for native Arabic speakers, it's not easy to understand what the Quran says. So imagine if it's not your language and you can't even read or write, and your holy book is in that foreign language. You rely on somebody else who you think can read it to interpret it for you. And the Afghans relied on the Saudi clerks that were imported to Afghanistan to tell them what the religion says, what the Quran says. And again, this is the interpretation that most Muslims reject. At that time, we were not concerned about this because we wanted the Saudis to tell them and to tell others, your religion, the Quran, basically urges you to fight for liberation. It's your duty to engage in jihad against these infidels, those Russians, those Soviet troops. That's all we cared about. We didn't care that the interpretation was also forcing women to hide in their homes, preventing girls from attending school. We just wanted to counter the Soviet influence. So that's why I call it an unholy alliance between the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia provided the ideology, this absurd version of Islam, and the Pakistanis provided the intelligence and training camps, and the Afghanis provided the fighters who were brainwashed into this absurd ideology. So we share some of the blame, because as soon as the Russians were driven out of Afghanistan, we washed our hands of Afghanistan. Some would say we've done that twice, we just did it again. What will happen to Afghani women today? They made progress for 20 years, and suddenly we're out. We did not negotiate with the Taliban that you must protect, preserve women's rights. We just wanted out. And now they can do whatever they want. And in most likelihood, just like most experts predicted, they will revert to their old way of governing and restrict women and girls. We would have a theocracy based on the Salafi interpretation that now Saudi Arabia is trying to abandon. So they exported it. Afghans took it to heart. They will continue to rule again based on this Wahhabi Salafi ideology, fortunately. Any other questions? One more in the back.
Just my name is Patrick Su. It's just a basic question. How come in the Muslim concept they don't allow women to walk or women to go outside? I just cannot understand why it happened that way.
Again, that's not true in the vast majority of Muslim countries. This is what we're trying to explain. Of the 57 Muslim majority countries, only 3 have severe restriction on women. Iran, which allows women to work and again, serve in the military and serve in parliament. Saudi Arabia, which is lifting many of these restrictions, slowly but gradually. And Afghanistan, which is the exception to the rule. There are 2 billion Muslims in the world. Afghanistan has about 40 million people. So we're talking about 20 million women that face this restriction out of 1 billion. So do we focus on the 980 million or the 20 million? That becomes a question. That's not the reality for most Muslim women. All right. Back to Ben here.